2017 CF 15684, State v. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, you're going to be sworn in.
Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your full name and date of birth.
Scott Edward Nelson, February 28, 1964.
Thank you. Ms. Burdick, is the state ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Lar, defense?
We are, Your Honor.
Mr. Nelson, are you ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, with respect to the state's closing argument, Ms. Burdick, how would you like to split the 90 minutes that the court's allowed?
If you could just tell me when I'm at 30.
Tell you when you're at 30? And then whatever time you have remaining for the state's rebuttal, 5-minute warning on the expiration of time, is that sufficient?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Lar, is a 5-minute warning sufficient for the defense? As far as, okay. And Ms. Burdick, you had indicated that you and Ms. Hicks were going to split the time. Are you doing the initial?
Yes.
And Mr. Lar, you are doing closing for the defense, correct?
I am, Your Honor.
All right, so Ms. Burdick, stay ready to proceed.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Lar, are you ready?
We are, Your Honor.
Mr. Nelson, you ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
Are all the jurors present? Yes. All right, let's please bring them in. Good morning, members of the jury. Good morning. Ms. Burdick, does the state ready to proceed, or does the state acknowledge the jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Lar, does the defense acknowledge the jury?
We are.
Mr. Nelson?
Yes, Your Honor.
Members of the jury, both the state and the defendant have now rested their cases. The attorneys now will present their final arguments. Please remember that what the attorneys say is not evidence or your instruction on the law. However, do listen closely to their arguments. They are intended to aid you in understanding this case. Each side will have equal time, but the state is entitled to divide this time between an opening argument and a rebuttal argument after the defense has given its closing argument. Ms. Burdick?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This, as we know, is Jennifer Fulford. This photograph is the last photograph taken of Miss Fulford when she was alive. From the testimony that you've heard in this case, you know that on the morning of September 27th of 2017, Mrs. Fulford had a dentist appointment at Advanced Dental in Winter Park. And in connection with that appointment, the dentist, for whatever reason, had this photograph taken, perhaps as part of the files for the practice. And we heard that Mrs. Fulford left there somewhere around 10 o'clock in the morning, clearly blissfully unaware of what was about to happen to her within the next hour or so. Now, September 27th of 2017 should have been only a joyous day in the lives of the extended Fulford family. You heard that Mrs. Fulford had plans to travel to Dallas the next day because a grandchild was born on September 27th of 2017. But instead, as her family attempted to contact her to share the good news, her phone was in the possession of somebody else. And that somebody is Scott Nelson. And we know that not only because of the exemplary police work of the Winter Park Police Department, but because Mr. Nelson himself told us so. You'll recall that portion of his statement where he said her phone kept ringing, so he shut it off at about 2 o'clock or so in the afternoon. So how do we know, aside from Mr. Nelson's statement, that he is the individual responsible for these crimes? So let's talk about that a little bit, separate and apart from the statements that he has made in this case. You will learn from the judge at the conclusion of the attorney's arguments that not only does the state of Florida have to prove that a crime was committed, we also are charged with the responsibility of proving that the defendant is the one who committed the crime. And throughout the course of the last 3 to 4 days, it's probably become obvious to you all that we were building a timeline of events. So although this document that I'm about to use during the closing argument is not in evidence and will not go back into the jury room with you, there are important times and dates reflected on here that I want to talk with you about briefly.
I mean, we approve.
Yes.
So let's start with the block of time that I initially began discussing as it relates to this photograph, states 12 in evidence, the last photograph taken of Mrs. Fulford when she was alive. You heard from Robert Fulford that he saw his wife at about 6 o'clock in the morning when she left for the job that she's held for a number of years as the caretaker for the Berman children. That the Fulfords live in Altamont Springs, and that the Bermans live in Winter Park, and that every morning she would travel from that location in Altamont early on to make sure that the Berman children were up, and now at this point in time it was just Oliver, were up and ready for school, that they had breakfast, and that she got them to Lake Highland Prep, where they had attended. And we know that she followed that typical routine because her cell phone records show her at 7:49 in the morning in the area. You saw the map, and that will go back into the jury room with you. That her phone, the call was bouncing off the towers near Lake Highland Prep. The first witness, Ms. Exum, the employee of Lake Highland Prep, indicated that school starts at 8 o'clock in the morning, so 7:49 a.m., of course, consistent with that routine that Ms. Fulford followed. Reed Berman told you that she returned to the home and that he had meetings at 9 o'clock or so. So he saw Mrs. Fulford at about 8:15 or 8:30 before he was going to go to his meetings. She had indicated to him that she had this dental appointment. And we see, based on the alarm.com records, that at 8:43, the front door to the Berman residence opened and closed, consistent, again, with Mrs. Fulford, because Mr. Berman said he would go out through the exercise door into the garage, but that she would be out front and go out the front door to her vehicle. The employee of Advanced Park Dental indicated that Ms. Fulford arrived about 9 minutes early for her 9 o'clock appointment, and that she was there for about an hour. Mrs. Grimm, Janet Grimm, the individual who had the appointment with Mrs. Fulford, said that there had been this prearranged situation where when Mrs. Fulford was going to leave the dental office, that she would call Mrs. Grimm to let her know that she was going to be back at the Berman residence, so Mrs. Grimm could come hang some artwork. So we see on Mrs. Fulford's phone records a call consistent with that testimony, which is now bouncing off those towers near the Advanced Park Dental in Winter Park. At 10:26, Mrs. Fulford left the area of the dentist office, and we see at 10:35 that the front door to the Berman residence opened and closed. Again, consistent with her traveling from the dental office, the short distance you'll see on the maps from the Park Avenue location to the Webster Avenue residence. At 11:11, again, we see Mrs. Fulford's phone bouncing off the same tower, but another sector of the tower, which you'll see again with the pie-shaped grid on the cell phone records, that there was this outgoing call to Ms. Grimm. Now, Ms. Grimm said that she missed a call from Mrs. Fulford, and then at 11:12, we heard Mr. Berman say that he had gotten a text from Mrs. Fulford reminding him of his regular obligation on the 27th of the month to pay his child support. Now, you learned from Amanda Stevens with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement that Verizon typically will not include in their call detail records text messages. So when you actually look at those records, you will not see a text message at 11:12 hours because that's not included. All right? Then we see at 11:30 the incoming call from Janet Grimm, consistent with her testimony, where she said she was able to reach Mrs. Fulford to confirm that she was home and basically that she would be on her way. And then finally, we have the receipt regarding the FedEx package delivery at 11:30 in the morning. Typical day in the life of Jennifer Fulford. What Mrs. Fulford didn't know was that 2 weeks before that, somebody who is a complete stranger to her had already hatched a plan to get some money. And then that person, Scott Nelson, had set up a checking account, took those checks to a Walmart, purchased some personal items, but also duct tape, a knife, zip ties, and then began to wait for an opportunity. Now, apparently, Mr. Nelson had made the acquaintance of somebody who was familiar with Mr. Berman. Mr. Nelson told you he didn't know Mr. Berman. Mr. Berman said he didn't know Mr. Nelson. Mr. Fulford said he didn't know Mr. Nelson. In fact, as we know, Mr. Nelson had really only been in the area since May of 2017. That he's from somewhere else, that he'd actually been in jail, and only it really ended up in Orlando as a result of the probation requirements attached to whatever sentence he had served. And so he makes the acquaintance of somebody who is familiar with Reed Berman, and it becomes known to Mr. Nelson that Mr. Berman probably has a lot of cash at his house. So Mr. Nelson decides at least as early as September 26th, if not earlier, we don't really know that, but at least as early as September 26th, that he's going to do a home invasion to get money so he can abscond from his probation. That he has developed this animus towards his probation officer for a variety of reasons. And so he needs to get as much money as he can and fast. And not the ability to turn something into money, but actual cash. So Mr. Nelson, we learned, went to the Berman residence on September 26th and staked the place out. Saw Mrs. Fulford with young Oliver in the driveway of the Berman residence and decided that Mrs. Fulford was going to be his way into the house. That there was no need to break in through a window or the garage. That the easiest way to accomplish his goal would be to just walk right up to the front door and ring the bell. So he hung around the neighborhood that night and waited for the opportunity. And he saw it at 11:30 in the morning when Reed Berman received that package from the Bacon of the Month Club. That was Mr. Nelson's opportunity to get in that house. So he had to be hanging out front somewhere, because in the aerial photograph of the Berman residence, you can see how that driveway is situated off of the road, and that there's a golf course across the street. So he had to be hanging out in the area. And 2 minutes, the amount of time that it probably takes to walk up the driveway, cross the street, walk up the driveway. That front door opens to the Berman residence. A minute later, based on the phone records from Mrs. Fulford's cell, Mrs. Fulford then calls Janet Grimm and says, there's a problem at the school with Oliver, don't come. Now we know there's no problem at the school with Oliver. Oliver was fine until about 3:30, 4 o'clock, when he didn't get picked up by Mrs. Fulford. A practice that Mr. Berman told you she had never failed him on. In the 6, 7 years she worked with him, not once did she fail to pick up his children. And then in sequence there, we see the records of the alarm company. Even though the actual system wasn't activated, that the alarm wasn't set, there are sensors that still detect movement, that still detect when someone's in a particular room, and whether or not the door is open or closed because of those magnetic contacts on the door. So at 11:47, that front door opens. Three minutes later, the motion detector in the master bedroom was activated. And 3 minutes after that, it's idle. Consistent with the amount of time it would take to go up to that bedroom, look around, grab the comforter, and then a minute later, come down with Mrs. Fulford wrapped in the comforter. "16 minutes later, the defendant, Mr. Nelson, is using Mrs. Fulford's ATM card with her PIN. It's indisputable. There's a picture of him wearing the white t-shirt, the shorts, the bright blue shoes, the watch with the plaid band. And while Mrs. Fulford is wrapped in this comforter in the back of her own car, Mr. Nelson is taking her money. But what Mr. Nelson miscalculated was who she really was. There's no way he could have known that she was the nanny. In fact, he said she wouldn't tell him any of that. And that once he was in that house, she was acting or doing things that he didn't like. In his statement, he says, what's wrong with somebody just giving a person what they want and letting them go on their way? But that she wasn't doing that. And so, on the fly, he had to think of another way to get money. So he withdraws $300 from her ATM. And since that's the maximum amount of money, give or take $10, that he could get at that time, he has to decide now what to do. What do I do? Now I have this seemingly uncooperative, to a certain extent, woman in the back of her own car. I gotta do something. Because he said that he asked her, basically, when Mr. Berman was gonna get home. And that she responded 5 o'clock, but that she had to leave to pick up her grandchild at 2 or 2:30, something like that. So now it's noon, and what do you do for the next 5 hours? Well, you have to find a place to get rid of the person that you kidnapped, that you took forcibly out of the home where she was entrusted, not only with maintaining the residence, but with the Berman children. And this is where we see the cell phone device of Mrs. Fulford, even though calls aren't being made or received, connecting with Verizon's network. Mrs. Stevens, or Amanda Stevens, with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, told you that cell phone companies will periodically send out a signal to all their devices, kind of, where are you? Keeping track of them. And that this was no different, and that about 13:25, converting the military time, it's 1:25 in the afternoon, the Fulford cell phone device is now connecting in the area of 535 and Apopka Island. This, as we know, and as is shown by the maps and evidence, is a good 20 miles southwest of Winter Park. On a Wednesday at noon, if you're traveling I-4 If you have to go through downtown Orlando, it's going to take you an hour. It's going to take you an hour to get out to the Disney area. Now, Mr. Nelson says that while Mrs. Fulford was in the back of that car, wrapped in the comforter, she was complaining that she couldn't breathe and that she was afraid that he was going to kill her. So Mr. Nelson had a full hour to contemplate what he was going to do with Jennifer Fulford. And as he told us on the stand yesterday, he decided he had to get rid of her. Challenged me on my interpretation of what get rid of somebody might mean. But of course, if you compare that testimony to what he said to the investigators, that meant kill her. That she would be a witness against him. And that if he was going to get in trouble and go to prison potentially for the rest of his life based on her testimony, then he might as well get rid of her. I guess strengthen his odds, maybe, of not being convicted if she's not available to testify. So from 125 to 151, a period, 125 to 134, Mr. Nelson is driving down in that Apopka Vineland, very crowded area, looking for a place to get rid of Jennifer Fulford. The first spot that he goes to really isn't conducive to getting rid of her. So at 134,
Ms. Burry, you use 30 minutes.
thank you. So at 134, he ends up in the area of Fenton, which is that street also off of Apopka Vineland that then goes into, from a paved road into a dirt road. And we can see from the aerial footage captured by Orange County's chase helicopter that there is an area obviously cleared for construction on the right, and then a very large, grassy, overgrown field on the left, separated from this road by a thicket of trees and brush. And he pulls over on the side of the road. And he opens that hatch, and Mrs. Fulford is getting loud. She's crying. At this point, she doesn't have the duct tape on her face, and that he then marches her through those trees and into that open field, where, if you look around, it looks like you're in the middle of nowhere. And that she began to beg for her life, and cry and scream and get louder and louder. So what he decided to do is wrap her whole head. And contrary to what he said, well, I didn't wrap it that tight, like that's some sort of concession. It wasn't that tight. We know from the testimony of the medical examiner that that was tight enough around her face that it caused her nose basically to be compressed against the side, cutting off her airway. But clearly that wasn't enough for Mr. Nelson, because what he then says he does is he has to go back to the car to get his knife. I asked him, was that in your pocket? Did you have that on you? He says he had to go back and get it. So in addition to this hour that it took for him to get from Winter Park to this area on Fenton, he now has an additional opportunity to reflect on what he's about to do. He leaves her there in the field and goes back to get this knife. Stabs her several times in the back, multiple times in the front. He says he recognized that he stabbed her in the heart. Consistent with what Dr. Stephanie told you the findings were at autopsy. Even though some findings were obscured by the advanced state of decomposition, consistent with the injuries that she received that caused her death. The remaining timeline shows that Mrs. Fulford's cell phone leaves with Mr. Nelson. It doesn't stay there. It ends up coming back up the I-4 corridor into downtown Orlando, where we know, because we saw the public's videos at 1507 and 1524, that he's in and out of that building. Then at 1540, he gets on that Lynx bus stop at the East Colonial, where ultimately those keys were found. That Mr. Nelson gets on the Lynx bus station downtown, heads back to Winter Park, and at 1631, tries to get more money, which was the goal of this whole operation. He's denied. So then he goes to the Amtrak station, ends up in Jacksonville, and then we see the timeline of Mr. Furman getting the police involved, Mr. Fulford, that Mr. Nelson then arrives in Jacksonville after midnight on September 27th. Ms. Fulford's car is discovered at about noon that day. A day after that, Mr. Nelson in Jacksonville now gets the $100 out. His photograph is published in the media, and somebody who knows him tells Winter Park who it is. And then on September 30th, Mrs. Fulford's body was located based on those cell maps that we talked about. So at the beginning of my comments, I told you that not only does the state have to prove who committed a crime, we have to prove the elements of the crime that we charged, or crimes in this case. Very shortly, you will receive instruction on the law from Judge White. And he will tell you that there are two ways that somebody can be convicted of first-degree murder. But before I talk about that, when you get the full instruction and you are presented with a verdict form, you will also have available to you what are known as lesser included offenses. And when you get the instruction and look at the form, you will see that the facts of this case also fit the facts for the lesser included offenses. And I like to say that these crimes are like a ladder. That the lesser offenses are sort of on the bottom rungs. And as you add different or more elements to it, you move up the rungs of that ladder until you reach the highest offense, which in this circumstance is murder in the first degree. You will also receive an instruction that it is your obligation as jurors to find the defendant guilty of the highest offense that has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So the two ways that you can find someone guilty of murder in the first degree are what we've been talking about this whole case, pretty much. Murder with premeditation, and then murder committed during the course of certain felonies. And the felonies here are, of course, carjacking, kidnapping, and robbery. Because we know that Mrs. Fulford was forcibly removed from the Berman residence. When you hear the instruction on kidnapping, you will have no doubt that that count has been proven. That the goal of that was accomplished by taking her vehicle. And that ultimately ending up at the ATM and removing money or her property against her will, with the intent, of course, to deprive her of it, was done after the force and the kidnapping occurred. So a murder that is committed during the course of events involving these felonies is also murder in the first degree. But the highlighted portion there is the portion that I wanted to talk about briefly. Because there was some suggestion by Mr. Nelson that it wasn't his intent to kill Mrs. Fulford. I think he said, it wasn't in my heart, really. It wasn't in my heart to kill her. So what is killing with premeditation? It is killing after consciously deciding to do so, and that the decision must be present in the mind at the time of the killing, and the law does not fix the exact period of time that must pass between the formation of the premeditated intent to kill and the killing. The period of time must be long enough to allow reflection by the defendant. Can there be any question from the facts in this case that Mr. Nelson had more than enough time to reflect on what he was about to do. If not during the drive, once he got there. Once he wrapped her head so tightly that she couldn't breathe. Once he left her there in that condition and went back to get something to finish her off with. Premeditation can be formed in an instant. Mr. Nelson had an infinite amount of time to make that decision. But it was more important to him to eliminate her as a witness. Let me speak for a moment about the defendant's statements. On direct examination yesterday, Mr. Nelson said about 4 things. His name, his date of birth, that he had 6 felony convictions, and that his probation officer, Julio Dominguez, is responsible for Jennifer Fulford's death. And that's it. So for Mr. Nelson, apparently what this trial was about is railing against his probation officer. It's clear Mr. Nelson has a problem with authority. That he feels, rightly or wrongly, victimized. He's the victim. This isn't his fault. This is his probation officer's fault. And that's what he got up on the stand to tell you. And then when we try to get into the details of what he did, all of a sudden I can't remember. Because he didn't want to talk about that. He wanted to talk about his probation officer. That's why he wrote the letter to Brian Ferreira. He wanted his story to get out. He wanted to be in this courtroom with the camera pointed at him so that he could say,
Comment.
Members of the jury, this is closing argument. It is up to you to decide what the evidence shows in this case.
so that he could say disgusting and vile things for their shock value. That's what this is about. Well, on September 27th of 2017, this was about getting money. Not about his probation officer or trying to make a point to the people that he considers snobs in Ware Park. This was about getting as much cash as he could from one source. And as he himself said yesterday, Mrs. Fulford's death was just collateral damage. There is absolutely no doubt, not just a reasonable doubt, no reasonable doubt. There is no doubt that Mr. Nelson plotted, planned, premeditated this home invasion robbery, and that when Mrs. Fulford did not comply with his requests, she became this collateral damage. As such, he is guilty of murder in the first degree, kidnapping, robbery, and carjacking. And I thank you for your attention to this point.